Worthy Grand Knight, Worthy Deputy Grand Knight. Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the Rosary. Something I've been doing a little bit of research on, and I thought I would share with you what I have found. Jewish men, when they pray, they wear a prayer shawl. And there are tassels on the corner of each prayer shawl, and tied into the tassels there are knots that have symbolic meaning and are meant to call to mind God's commandments. There may be a distant connection between that and the origin of the Rosary. We can't draw a direct line. Where we can really pick up the beginnings of the Rosary are in the 2nd century. In the 2nd century, there were many Christians who went out into the deserts of Palestine and Egypt. It's really the birth of the monastic movement. They sought to get away from the persecutions. They sought to get away from Roman cities that were full of vice and corruption and temptations. They sought to live their lives to kind of radical witness to the gospel. And so they went out into these lonely desert places. Sometimes they lived in community, sometimes they lived by themselves. But in taking on this difficult way of life, they also put themselves in a position where they couldn't always attend Mass. They didn't always have access to the Eucharist. And so they had to come up with some innovative spiritual practices. It's the Desert Fathers, the leaders of these monastic communities, are responsible, for example, for the introduction of Eucharistic adoration. One of the devotional practices that came out of this experiment in the Egyptian desert was using stones to count and sequence prayers. So they would have a basket, usually have 300 stones, and over the course of the day, they would recite a prayer. Usually a very simple prayer, like the Jesus Prayer, for example, which comes from, again, this monastic experiment that began in the 2nd century. So they would say a prayer and toss a stone into the basket, and when the basket was full, they would say a prayer and toss the stones back out of the basket. And when the basket was emptied again, they had completed their prayers of the day. St. John Cassian brought monasticism, brought that monastic movement to Europe in the 4th century. Well, I should back up just a second. St. Pacomius, who's one of the Desert Fathers, a fascinating saint who I don't have time to get into today, but I like Pacomius. There's a legend about Pacomius taming a crocodile and being able to ride the crocodile back and forth across the river. And you think, well, yeah, it's a great children's story. But there was a man in Costa Rica who did the same thing until the crocodile died in like 2011. There's even video footage of it. So it's an interesting story. I like Pacomius. So, but Pacomius is credited with the development of the prayer chord. That is actually tying knots into a string to sequence and count prayers. So St. John Cassian brings monasticism to Europe in the 4th century. He brings the prayer chord with him. And in Europe, it's adapted to the recitation of the Psalms. So the prayer chords are elongated. Often the monks would tie the knots into the ropes that they used as their belts. They had a long rope that would hang down one side, and they would tie 150 knots into that cord, and follow along as they prayed their way through the Psalms. It's quite a time-consuming task to pray all the way through 150 Psalms, and most people in Europe at that time were illiterate. So it became kind of a practice of the laity to substitute just the Our Father 150 times for each of the Psalms. And they would use prayer chords or strings of beads to count off the correct number of prayers. This led to something called the Potter Nostra, which just means Our Father, but it's a string of beads in varying lengths, often with a large bead that would fit through a buttonhole so that it could be worn on a lapel or worn over a belt. It was just a kind of almost universal accessory in medieval Europe, used primarily for praying the Our Father. there was no particular standardization of those. They came in all sorts of different lengths. But during the medieval period, there was also significant growth in popular devotion to Mary. For example, it became the custom to adorn statues of Mary with garlands of roses, strings of roses broken up into 10 white separated by a red, 10 white separated by a red, 150 in total. We still see vestiges of that in our May crownings, which often have alternating groups of red and white roses. In the 1100s, female anchorites in England took this idea and developed a version of the Pater Nostra that was really a Marian devotion. It was 5 decades of Hail Marys, each one separated by an Our Father. In 1214, St. Dominic was in southern France combating the Albigensian heresy. And while praying for guidance regarding how best to do this, he experienced a vision of the Blessed Mother. And in this vision, she gave him instructions to create a standardized form of chaplet, of beads, for praying what's called the Marian Psalter, which is this collection of Hail Marys separated by our fathers. It's from St. Dominic that we get this, the form of the Rosary that we all know today. And just as a side note, when did you last meet an Albigensian? So pray your rosaries. Around 1400, a Carthusian monk named Dominic Prussia began the practice of adding scriptural verses to the recitation of the roses, of adding meditations to the recitation of the rosary. And rosary just means, by the way, garland of roses. That's actually what the word means. In 1569, the rosary received official approval. Pope Pius V standardized the associated meditations, and it's from him that we get the sorrowful, glorious, and joyful mysteries. In 1571, St. Pope Pius V asked Catholics to pray the rosary on the eve of the Battle of Lepanto, which was a naval battle in which the forces of the Catholic League won an upset victory over the Ottoman Turks, thus preserving Christian Europe. There was a very real possibility at the time that all of Europe would fall to the Turks. The Pope commemorated the victory by instituting the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, which we still observe every October 7th. In the wake of the Battle of Lepanto, a number of confraternities were established to encourage and promote the praying of the Rosary. Most of those confraternities were essentially consolidated into the Legion of Mary in 1921. And today the Legion of Mary has 10 million members worldwide. I had no idea that it was that large and that active. In 1917, during the Fatima apparitions, Our Lady asked the children to add the Fatima prayer to the Rosary. She gave them the prayer and asked that it be added to the Rosary. That's the one that goes, "Oh my Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven, especially those most in need of thy mercy." And in 2002, Pope John Paul II added the Luminous Mysteries. So there's your crash 10-minute history of the Rosary. Thank you very much.